Late summer, 1987. A mountain ridge near the Panjshir Valley, Afghanistan. The air is thin, dusty, and carries the scent of dried wormwood. At an elevation of 2,800 meters, a Soviet SA-8 Gecko mobile missile battery sits entrenched in a scraped earth revetment. The crew moves with the dull rhythm of a long deployment. A diesel generator thrums, providing power to the vehicle's sophisticated radar array, the system's eyes. Inside the cramped command vehicle, the air is thick with the smell of stale electronics and sweat. The radar operator's face is washed in the pale green glow of his scope. His hand rests on the control yoke, slowly painting the sky sector by sector. The familiar, comforting blips of friendly helicopter traffic drift across the screen. The war, from this vantage point, is a series of calm, electronic pulses. Suddenly a new trace appears. It is not the slow, meandering signature of a helicopter. It is a razor-thin sliver of light, materializing at the extreme edge of the scope. It does not approach like an aircraft. It erupts into existence, already screaming towards the center of the screen at an impossible velocity. The operator's breath catches. He slams the lock-on switch. The system whines, trying to acquire. But it is not being hunted. It is the hunter. Before the tracking system can even compute a firing solution, the trace merges with the center of the scope, their own position. Outside, a sound tears the sky apart. Not the roar of a jet, but a short, sharp, metallic shriek. The radar operator has just enough time to see the dish of his own system through the viewport. Then a sunbright flash consumes it. The warhead, guided unerringly by the radar's own energy, converts the site's source of power and awareness into a storm of white-hot shrapnel. In the sudden, deafening silence that follows, one thought echoes in the stunned crewman's mind: nothing we have can move that fast. To understand the profound shock of that moment in 1987, one must first comprehend the nature of the sky the Soviet Union had owned for nearly a decade. December 1979. The Soviet 40th Army crossed the Amu Darya River not just with tanks and BMPs, but with an umbrella of aviation that was, in the context of the Afghan battlefield, overwhelmingly dominant. The Afghan Mujahideen possessed no air force. Their anti-aircraft arsenal consisted of a handful of aging, optically guided ZPU-2 and ZPU-4 heavy machine guns, and the occasional World War II-era ZS-3 field gun used in a direct-fire role. The sky, for all practical purposes, belonged to the Soviets. This dominance shaped the very geometry of the war. The Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter became the signature weapon of the conflict, a flying armored vehicle that could deliver devastating rocket and cannon fire into mountain passes, shepherd convoys through hostile territory, and insert or extract Spetsnaz teams with brutal efficiency. Fixed-wing aircraft like the Su-25 Frogfoot provided close air support, while massive Il-76 transports airdropped supplies to remote outposts. Soviet aviation operated with a sense of impunity, particularly at medium and high altitudes. To protect this aerial armada and their own ground forces, the Soviets deployed a layered, integrated air defense system directly from their core military doctrine. This was not a makeshift arrangement. It was a scaled-down version of the system designed to defend the Soviet motherland from NATO. It was a bubble of electronic awareness. At the outer layer, strategic airfields and major bases like Bugram and Shindand were protected by long-range SA-2 Guideline, or SA-3 Goa missiles, relics of Vietnam but still lethal to high-flying, non-maneuvering targets. More mobile, and thus more dangerous for tactical aviation, were the medium-range systems, the wheeled SA-6 Gainful and the tracked SA-11 Buk. But the workhorses, the ones that accompanied motor rifle regiments and provided point defense for forward bases, were the short-range systems. The SA-8 Gecko on its six-wheeled chassis, the SA-9 Gaskin on the BRDM-2, and the later infrared-guided SA-13 Gopher. These systems were linked by a web of radar. Early warning spoon rest and flat-face radars scanned the horizons. Fire dome and land roll fire control radars guided the missiles to their targets. For a Soviet SAM crew, the process was a technical ballet. Detect a target on the search radar, slew the tracking radar to lock on, let the computer calculate the intercept and fire. Their world was one of frequencies, sweep patterns and blips on a screen. The enemy was an abstract signature, not a man with a rifle. From 1980 to 1985, this system was largely unchallenged. Mujahideen attempts to use captured SA-7 Grail missiles, a primitive, first-generation manpads, man-portable air defense system, were mostly futile. The SA-7 had severe limitations. It could only engage from behind, was confused by simple flares, and was useless against fast jets. Soviet pilots developed tactics of climbing to higher, safer altitudes after attack runs, well above the effective range of any Mujahideen weapon. The psychological impact was profound. For the Soviet soldier on the ground, the sight and sound of a hind approaching was often the prelude to salvation. For the Mujahideen fighter in the hills, it was the sound of inevitability, a technological terror they could not touch. The Soviet Air Force and Army aviation operated within a secure bubble, a dome of electronic and metallic protection that made the Afghan sky a one-way mirror. They looked down with impunity. That mirror was about to crack, but not from the weapon everyone would remember. The first true fracture in Soviet aerial dominance arrived not from a complex electronic system, but from a simple, brutal, and personal weapon. In the spring of 1986, through a covert CIA program codenamed Cyclone, the first batches of the American FIM-92 Stinger missile began to filter into Afghanistan. The Stinger was a generational leap over the SA-7. It was a fire-and-forget weapon with an advanced seeker head that could discriminate between flares and a jet engine's hot metal. It had greater range, a more powerful warhead, and crucially it could engage targets head-on. For the Mujahideen, it transformed air defense from a collective, static effort into an individual act of vengeance. A single fighter on a mountain ridge could now down a multi-million-dollar helicopter or aircraft. The psychological and tactical impact was immediate and seismic. Soviet and Afghan Democratic Republic (DRA) aircraft loss rates spiked. Pilot morale plummeted. The previously routine flight patterns became perilous. Soviet aviation was forced into a desperate adaptation. Attack runs were conducted from higher altitudes, reducing accuracy. Helicopters employed violent, fuel-gulping jinking maneuvers during ingress and egress. They flew primarily at night or in poor weather, times when the Stinger's infrared seeker was less effective. Expensive and cumbersome infrared countermeasure pods, like the L-166V1 Irtish, were hastily bolted onto Hinds and HIP transports, creating a constant chaff-like shower of hot flares behind them. This was the war the world saw. The image of the lone mujahid, a Stinger tube on his shoulder, staring down a hind, became the iconic symbol of the Afghan resistance. It was a narrative of technological parity, of David versus Goliath. And it led the Soviet High Command to a critical and ultimately fatal conclusion. From the Soviet perspective, the Stinger had redrawn the map of the threat envelope. The low-altitude and medium-altitude bands, the realm of helicopters and slow ground attack aircraft, were now contested and dangerous. But the high-altitude domain, the cruising space for their command and control aircraft, reconnaissance planes, and the high-flying IL-76 transports, remained a sanctuary. It was protected by the very same SAM network that had always been there. The SA-8s, SA-13s, and the longer-range systems created a safe ceiling. Soviet planners reasoned that while the Mujahideen could now sting them at treetop level, they were utterly defenseless against anything flying above 12,000 feet. Their Integrated Air Defense System (IADS) was the unbreachable roof over the battlefield. This belief was reinforced by doctrine. Soviet air defense was built to fight a peer adversary, NATO. It was designed to detect, track, and engage high-performance aircraft like the F-15, F-16, and B-52. The idea that a technologically primitive guerrilla force could threaten these systems directly was considered absurd. The SAM sites were hunters, not prey. Their radars pulsed confidently, sweeping the high mountain valleys, watching for the non-existent Afghan Air Force, secure in their role as the guardians of the sky. Their confidence was a symptom of a narrowed focus. They had adapted to the threat they could see, the heat-seeking missile fired from a ridge. They were utterly blind to the threat they could not conceive. A missile that did not target their aircraft but targeted their perception. A weapon designed not to kill machines but to kill information. While Soviet commanders worried about the bee sting of the Mujahideen below, a far more dangerous predator was being unleashed from above, one that viewed the Soviet air defense network not as a shield, but as a detailed menu. The stage was set not for another duel between an aircraft and a missile, but for a silent, high-speed duel between a sensor and a. The roof was about to collapse from the inside. For Senior Sergeant Alexander Petrovich Ivanov, a radar operator in a Soviet SA-8 battery, the war was a world of sterile data and controlled routine. His battlefield was not the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, but the 12-inch diameter of a cathode ray tube. His enemy was not a bearded Dutchman with a rifle, but an anonymous, flickering blip that represented a violation of protected airspace. His training had been comprehensive, rooted in the rigid doctrines of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, Voiska PVO. He knew the signature of every friendly aircraft, the slow pulse of a Mi-8 hip, the faster, harder return of a Mi-24 Hind, the distant, high-altitude trace of an IL-76. His task was a continuous cycle: scan, identify, evaluate. The system did the heavy lifting. His role was to be the vigilant human in the loop, to interpret and authorize. The SA-8's land roll radar was his eyes, extending his vision for dozens of kilometers. He felt a sense of immense, detached power. With a switch flip and a button press, he could unleash a 9M33 missile at Mach 2.5. The destruction was clean, clinical, and distant. This existence bred a profound, unshakable confidence. His vehicle, the 9A33 Gecko, was a marvel of integrated technology. The radar, the missiles, the computer, all were housed on a single amphibious chassis. It was a self-contained fortress of electronic warfare. The stories of Stinger's downing helicopters were something he heard about, a war fought in a different, more primitive layer of the atmosphere. It did not concern him. In fact, it reinforced his unit's importance. The fixed-wing pilots and the helicopter crews needed them. They were the shepherds, keeping the wolves, the hypothetical high-altitude intruders, away from the flock. His daily routine was dictated by the rhythm of the radar's sweep. He would power up the system at dawn, the screen blooming to life with the green glow of the terrain and the comforting, predictable patterns of friendly traffic. There were alerts, of course. Sometimes a Mujahideen supply plane, a Ancient and Colt, or a drug runner's Cessna, would try to slip through the valleys at night. These were slow, easy targets. The engagement was a formality. Lock, fire, watch the blip dissolve into a scatter of meaningless fragments. It was proof of system integrity. The psychological environment was one of sensory overload coupled with physical isolation. The hum of the generators, the static hiss of the speakers, the glow of the instruments, these were constants. The world outside the armored vehicle was reduced to a minor concern. They were defended by perimeter troops, their security guaranteed by their own lethal reach. They were not infantry facing the existential fear of an ambush. Their fear, trained into them, was of electronic failure, of a burned-out tube or a software glitch. Not of a weapon they could not see coming. This doctrinal and human mindset created a critical vulnerability. The entire system, from the conscript operator to the colonel at district headquarters, operated on a fundamental assumption: that radar emission was an act of dominance, a declaration of control over the electromagnetic spectrum. To turn on your radar was to assert, "I see you." The concept that this act could also be a scream of, "Here I am," a beacon for a weapon that fed on radar energy itself, was alien. It was a perversion of the logical order of their technological world. Sergeant Ivanov was trained to find a target. It was inconceivable that the target was and always had been him. He was the perfect representative of a system at its peak of confidence, blind to the paradigm shift streaking toward him at Mach 2. His expertise, his routine, his very purpose, were about to become the parameters of his own destruction. While the Soviet operator trusted his radar, in a secure facility half a world away, American engineers had spent decades perfecting its annihilation. The AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile, HARM, was not merely a new weapon, it was the physical manifestation of a revolutionary battlefield philosophy: electronic kill chain. Its purpose was brutally elegant. In a modern radar-dependent air defense network, destroying the radar does not just blind one missile battery, it cripples an entire sector's ability to coordinate fire, creating a temporary window of immunity for strike aircraft. The HARM was a key designed to pick this electronic lock. Its anatomy was optimized for a single vicious task. At its core lay the broadband digital seeker. Unlike previous anti-radiation missiles, ARMs, like the AGM-45 Shrike or AGM-78 Standard Arm, which were tuned to specific known radar frequencies, the HARM seeker was a voracious listener. It could scan across a vast swath of the electromagnetic spectrum, from the C-band to the Ku-band and beyond. It didn't just look for one voice, it listened for the entire choir of a Soviet air defense network: the search radars, the tracking radars, the height finders. Its computer could analyze the pulse repetition frequency, PRF, the scan pattern and the signal strength, instantly comparing it to a preloaded library of emitter fingerprints stored in its memory. In milliseconds, it could identify a land roll from a fire dome, prioritize the most immediate threat and commit. But its most psychologically devastating feature was its memory mode, or pre-briefed PB mode. A Soviet SAM crew's standard reaction to the threat of an arm was to execute a radar shutdown drill. They would flick off their emitter, hoping the incoming missile would lose guidance and sail harmlessly past. This was effective against older, dumb arms. The harm rendered this tactic obsolete. In PB mode, the launching aircraft could feed the missile targeting data before launch. The suspected location and type of a radar, often gleaned from earlier surveillance or signals intelligence SIGINT. The harm would then fly a pre-programmed course to that location using its inertial navigation system. If the target radar was emitting, the harm would guide precisely onto it. If the crew realized the danger and shut down, the missile would simply continue to the last known coordinates, or the center of the suspected deployment area, and detonate. For the crew, the act of going silent, their primary survival instinct, offered no guarantee of safety. The weapon had a grudge memory. Finally, there was its kinetic profile. The harm was a fast weapon. Propelled by a solid-fuel rocket motor to over Mach 2, it covered distance with terrifying rapidity, leaving little time for reaction or evasion. Its blast fragmentation warhead was not designed for pinpoint accuracy against an aircraft. It was designed to saturate a radar van or missile transporter with shrapnel, destroying the delicate antenna arrays and electronics that constituted the system's nervous system. It traded the surgical kill for the catastrophic mission kill. This combination of attributes made the harm a predator of a completely new order. It did not engage in a duel. It executed a precise, high-speed assassination of a capability. It turned the SAM site's greatest strength, its radiating radar, into its most glaring vulnerability. The weapon existed in a symbiosis with its prey. The more proficient, active, and confident the radar operator, the brighter the beacon, the more certain the kill. The engineers had built not just a missile but a paradox, and were preparing to inject it into the heart of the Soviet air defense network in Afghanistan. The existence of the harm was one thing. Getting it into the skies over Afghanistan and making it work was an entirely different, and deeply clandestine, challenge. This was not the Stinger program, where a weapon could be handed to a fighter after a few weeks of training. This required a complex, deniable infrastructure. The CIA's solution was a shadow operation of breathtaking audacity, often referred to later by insiders as Project 99. The problem was multi-layered. The harm required a sophisticated launch platform, an aircraft with the right avionics to program the missile, the pylons to carry it, and the radar warning receivers, RWR, to detect and identify enemy emitters. The Mujahideen had no such aircraft. The CIA's answer was to create one. The primary workhorse became the Grumman A6E Intruder. Chosen for its durability, long loiter time, and advanced avionics suite, specifically the Target Recognition Attack Multisensor, TRAM, turret, the A6 was a perfect, if unconventional, candidate. Selected aircraft were subtly modified. Their U.S. Navy markings were removed. Their sophisticated IFF identification friend or foe, and communications gear were either altered or supplemented to prevent any accidental traceback to the U.S. Most crucially, engineers developed an interface to allow the ASIXS systems to talk to the harm, feeding it targeting data. But where to base these digital assassins? They could not operate from inside Afghanistan. The answer lay across the border in Pakistan. With the quiet assent of the ISI, Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, a corner of a Pakistani airbase, likely Shahbaz Air Base near Jacobabad or another remote field, became a covert nest. Here, under a veil of utmost secrecy, a small detachment of aircraft operated. They were not flown by Mujahideen. They were flown by a unique breed, civilian contract pilots, many of them former U.S. military aviators, and possibly accompanied by CIA paramilitary officers acting as systems operators. They were ghosts on the payroll, their existence deniable at the highest levels of the U.S. government. The mission profile was a study in calculated risk and precision. An A-6, laden with 2 or 4 harms, would take off from its Pakistani sanctuary at night. It would fly nap of the earth, using the terrain to mask its radar signature as it penetrated Afghan airspace. It would not hunt randomly. Its targets were pre-selected based on weeks of signals intelligence SIGINT, from U.S. satellites, RC-135 Rivet joint aircraft, and even reports from Mujahideen scouts who noted the locations of SAM sites that were particularly active or troublesome. The pilot's goal was not to see the target but to tempt it. He would climb briefly into a position where his aircraft would appear as a faint, tantalizing blip on the Soviet search radar scopes. The hope was to trigger the site's tracking radar, the lock-on. The moment the Soviet fire dome or land roll radar switched from search to track, its focused high-energy beam became a screaming dinner bell. The ASIXSRWR would scream a warning, but for the pilot this was the signal. He would designate the emitter, the harm seeker would slave to the signal, and with a shudder and a roar, the missile would drop off the rail and accelerate into the blackness. The pilot would then immediately turn and dive back to the safety of the terrain, egressing at high speed. He never saw the impact. His job was simply to deliver the key and turn it. The harm, now an autonomous, intelligent projectile, would complete the journey. For the Mujahideen on the ground, the first evidence of the mission would be a sudden, violent explosion on a distant mountain ridge where a Soviet SAM site was known to be, an explosion that seemed to come from nowhere, preceded by no attacking aircraft they could see or hear. This was covert air power in its purest, most impersonal form. It was warfare by remote electronic proxy, a surgical strike conducted from the shadows, leaving the enemy baffled and a critical piece of their military architecture in flames. From the perspective of the Afghan Mujahideen, the war against Soviet air power had two distinct faces. The first was intimate, visceral, and triumphant, the stinger. A fighter would feel the heat of the exhaust wash, hear the whoosh of the missile leaving the tube, and often witness the fireball as the helicopter spiraled into the canyon. It was a personal victory, a tangible reclaiming of their sky. The weapon's success was measured in burnt wreckage and captured pilots. The second face was abstract, mysterious, and divine, the harm. They rarely, if ever, saw the weapon that delivered it. They knew the locations of the Soviet SAM sites, those fortified, buzzing positions on high ground that made their own aerial resupply missions so deadly. Then, one night, without warning, a site would simply erupt in a cataclysm of fire. There was no preceding jet scream, no tracers arcing through the sky. Just annihilation from the void. To many, it was interpreted as the hand of God, or the work of particularly effective sabotage by their own scouts. The idea that a missile could fly dozens of miles, guided by an invisible beam of light, to kill a radar was beyond their frame of reference. For them, the result was what mattered. A key corridor for their own supply planes, flown by the CIA's proprietary airline Air America, or other clandestine carriers, was suddenly inexplicably clear. The harm was not a weapon they used. It was a benevolent force that worked on their behalf in the realm of the unseen. For the CIA officers running the war from Islamabad and Langley, the harm represented a profound strategic evolution. The Stinger program had been about tactical defense, protecting Mujahideen forces and bases from attack helicopters and close air support. It was reactive. The harm program was about strategic offense, actively dismantling the enemy's infrastructure. It was proactive. Their perspective was that of a systems analyst. They viewed the Soviet air defense network in Afghanistan not as a collection of individual sites, but as an organism. The radar signals were its nervous system. The command links were its synapses. The harm was a neurotoxin designed to sever those connections. Each successful strike did more than destroy a single radar. It degraded the entire network's cohesion. It forced the Soviets to operate their remaining radars sporadically and with fear, which in turn degraded their ability to protect their aircraft, which were now more vulnerable to stingers lower down. It was a virtuous cycle of degradation. The psychological warfare component was equally valuable. The CIA understood that confusion and a loss of technological confidence could be as damaging as physical destruction. The baffled Soviet reports filtering through signals intercepts, describing attacks with no discernible launch platform, were a sign of success. They were not just destroying hardware, they were eroding doctrine. They were demonstrating to the Soviet military that even their most advanced, behind-the-front-lines assets were not safe, that the United States could reach deep into their battle space with impunity and a terrifying new kind of weapon. For the case officer in Pakistan, approving a harm mission was a different calculus than authorizing a Stinger shipment. It was not about empowering an individual fighter. It was about executing a precise, high-value strike on the enemy's central nervous system. The risk was higher, the deniability thinner, but the payoff was exponentially greater. It was the difference between swatting a mosquito and sabotaging the insecticide factory. The harm turned the CIA from a supplier of defensive arms into a direct, if invisible, combatant in the electronic spectrum, shaping the battlefield in ways the foot soldier on the ground could feel but never fully understand. This dual perspective, the Mujahideen's mystical gratitude and the CIA's cold, systematic targeting, encapsulated the new layered reality of the war. One conflict was fought in the mountains with bullets and heat seekers. The other was fought in the ether with signals and microprocessors, and its victories were silent explosions on distant ridges that opened the sky. The initial harm strikes in 1986 to 87 did not register in Moscow or Washington as a definitive turning point. They manifested as a series of disconnected, perplexing anomalies, ghosts in the Soviet machine. The first incidents were fragmentary and dismissed. A Soviet SA-13 Gopher battery, operating in support of a motor rifle regiment near Jalalabad, reported a catastrophic explosion at its position just after midnight. The initial after-action report, filed by a shaken platoon commander, cited possible ammunition cook-off or sabotage. The site's dog-ear search radar had been active. The tracking system was in standby. The explosion was localized to the radar vehicle itself, shredding its delicate antenna array. The missiles and their transporter erector launcher, TEL, were untouched. Sabotage by local sympathizers within the Afghan auxiliaries was deemed the most likely cause. A security crackdown followed. Then a week later and 300 kilometers to the west, near Kandahar, an SA-8 Gecko battery met a similar fate. This time the radar operator had just achieved a tentative lock on a faint, fleeting contact to the south. As he initiated the engagement sequence, his world dissolved in noise and flame. The subsequent investigation found shrapnel patterns inconsistent with a ground-placed explosive. The warhead had come from above and at a shallow angle. The theory shifted. Perhaps it was a lucky long-range artillery strike from a Mujahideen position in the mountains, a 1-in-a-million hit. But the 1-in-a-million hits began to form a pattern. In the Panjshir Valley, a critical thoroughfare for Soviet operations, a key SA-6 gainful site protecting the air corridor into Bugram Air Base was struck. The straight flush fire control radar was obliterated. Witnesses, Afghan conscripts manning perimeter posts, reported hearing a brief high-pitched shriek in the seconds before impact, distinct from the whistle of incoming artillery. No corresponding jet engine noise was heard. No Mujahideen groups in the area claimed responsibility for artillery fire of such improbable accuracy. Alarm bells, still muted, began to ring within the Soviet 40th Army Signals Intelligence (SIGINT) units and the GRU military intelligence. Fragmented data was collated. The attacks shared eerie commonalities. 1. Target, always the radar vehicle, never the missile launchers unless they were collocated. 2. Timing, often coincided with the moment of radar activation or lock-on. 3. Audio signature, reports of a short, sharp, metallic scream. 4. Lack of launch platform, no visual or radar contact with any aircraft immediately prior. The initial Soviet hypothesis was the emergence of a new, dedicated sabotage unit within the Mujahideen, perhaps equipped with laser-designated munitions or a sophisticated recoilless rifle. Counterintelligence operations intensified. Suspected informants were detained. Yet the attacks continued, now spreading across different military districts. The true moment of dawning horror came not from a field report, but from a technical analysis. In early 1987, fragments of a warhead were recovered from the wreckage of a destroyed flat-face radar near Khost. The fragments were not from any known Soviet, Chinese, or bloc munition. They were shipped under utmost secrecy to a specialist laboratory in the Soviet Union. The metallurgy and the design of the preformed fragments were telling. But the clincher was a partially intact section of the seeker head casing, with charred but discernible circuitry. Soviet engineers, who had studied Western technology for decades, recognized the architecture. This was not laser guidance. This was the remains of a passive broadband radio frequency seeker. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together with chilling clarity. This was no sabotage. This was no artillery. This was an American anti-radiation missile of a previously unknown and terrifying capability. The implications were staggering. It meant American or American proxy aircraft were operating with impunity in Afghan airspace. It meant their entire air defense doctrine, based on the safety of radar emission, was fundamentally compromised. The confident bubble of electronic awareness had not just been pierced, it had been turned into a death trap. The roof they thought was solid was, in fact, made of glass, and something from the dark outside was now systematically breaking every pane. The laboratory report from Moscow sent a seismic shock through the command structure of the 40th Army and the Soviet Air Defense Forces (PVO). The confirmation of a next-generation American arm in theater changed everything. This was no longer a series of unfortunate accidents, it was a coordinated, technological offensive. The period from mid-1987 into 1988 became a desperate and losing battle of adaptation, where every Soviet countermeasure was met by the harm's relentless, logical design. The initial reaction was one of disciplined procedure. New orders flashed to every SAM and radar unit in Afghanistan. Emissions control, EMCON, strict. Radars were to be powered up only for minimal, critical periods. The search and track cycle was to be fragmented. One site would flicker its search radar on for a few seconds, then shut down, hoping to pass targeting data to a neighboring site, which would then briefly activate its tracking radar. It was a tactical ballet of blinding and glimpsing, designed to deny the harm a steady lock. It failed. The harm's pre-briefed PB mode made a mockery of it. CIA SIGINT, now focused on mapping the Soviet EMCON patterns, would identify a site's general location during its rare emissions. A harm mission would be programmed. The launching A-6 or, increasingly by late 1987, the even faster F-16 Fighting Falcon, also modified for the role, would fire into the blackness towards the coordinates. If the radar was silent, the missile would fly to the spot and detonate. The resulting airburst might not destroy the vehicles if they were widely dispersed, but the hail of shrapnel would shred antennae, sever cables, and kill crew outside their armor. The site was rendered combat ineffective, a mission kill. The psychological toll was worse. Crews now felt unsafe even when their equipment was powered down. Their sanctuary had been violated. Soviet technicians scrambled for technical countermeasures. They attempted to deploy radar decoys, simple transmitters designed to mimic the signature of a fire control radar, placed a kilometer or two from the main site. The first time this was tried, near the Salong Pass, it resulted in 2 explosions. The decoy was obliterated. Minutes later, the main site's radar, having activated in the belief the threat was gone, was also destroyed. The harm's emitter library had correctly identified the decoy as a non-priority target, but the launch aircraft, monitoring the scene, had simply fired a second missile at the real emitter when it lit up. The system learned and it was patient. The most profound shift was psychological and doctrinal. The Soviet SAM crew, trained to be an active hunter, was forced into the role of a passive, fearful target. Commanders began ordering the use of optronic systems, television and infrared cameras, for tracking targets, a method that was less accurate, shorter-ranged, and useless in poor weather. It was a regression in technology, a voluntary self-blinding. The layered, integrated air defense network began to decouple. Sites could no longer rely on data from neighboring radars without giving away their own positions. The network became a series of isolated, suspicious nodes, each afraid to communicate. The climax of this phase was not a single battle, but a pattern of systemic degradation. By 1988, the Mujahideen's clandestine air bridge, run by the CIA with modified C-130s and smaller aircraft, operated with renewed boldness. They flew at medium altitudes, previously a suicide mission, through corridors where the Soviet SAM umbrella had been shredded by harm strikes. Soviet transport and reconnaissance aircraft, which had relied on the high-altitude SAM shield, now found themselves potentially vulnerable to a threat they could not see or understand. The safe ceiling had collapsed. For the Soviet soldier and officer, a new and demoralizing legend spread through the ranks. They called the unseen weapon the Taiki Ubiyitsa, the silent killer. It spoke of a war where the enemy was not a man, but a ghost in the machine, where the tools of your own superiority became the instruments of your demise. The turning point was complete. Mastery of the electromagnetic spectrum, the cornerstone of modern Soviet warfare, had been decisively, irrevocably seized by an invisible hand. The technological confidence that underpinned their entire presence in Afghanistan was in ashes, mirroring the shattered radar dishes scattered across the rocky hillsides. The immediate aftermath of the harm campaign was not a frontline collapse, but a profound and creeping paralysis within the Soviet air defense and aviation apparatus in Afghanistan. The consequences were felt in concrete, tactical degradations that altered the daily calculus of the war. 1. The forced regression to the optical age. The most visible change was the physical silencing of radar vehicles. SA-8s, SA-13s, and SA-SAXS increasingly operated with their distinctive dish and array antennas stowed or covered. Engagement sequences now relied on visually acquired targets or crude-bearing data from remote, decoupled observation posts. This severely reduced effective engagement range, reaction time, and all-weather capability. A system designed to engage supersonic jets at 15 kilometers was now reduced to dueling with slow-moving transports at visual range, if it could see them at all. The technological regression was a direct admission of defeat in the electronic war. 2. The opening of the medium-altitude corridors. This was the harm's primary strategic gift to the Mujahideen. CIA and ISI led supply flights, particularly the Black Cat missions using modified aircraft like the C-130 Learjets and Casa-212s, could now fly higher and faster on certain routes. Flying at 10,000 to 15,000 feet, they were above the effective range of most small arms and heavy machine gun fire, and crucially, above many of the optically guided Zu-23s. With the SAM threat suppressed in key areas like the approaches to the Panjshir or around Khost, loss rates for these critical resupply missions dropped significantly. The Mujahideen's logistical lifeline became more robust and predictable. 3. The crippling of Soviet deep strike in ISR. The Soviet Air Force's own ability to conduct reconnaissance and interdiction deep in Mujahideen territory was hampered. High-altitude platforms like the MiG-25RB Foxbat reconnaissance aircraft or the IL-76 Candid command posts had relied on the ground-based SAM umbrella for protection. With that umbrella proven porous to a mysterious high-speed threat, mission planners grew wary. The fear of the Taiki Ubiitsa extended its shadow. If it could kill a ground radar, what variant might exist to kill an aircraft's own radar or electronic systems? A climate of risk aversion began to affect Soviet air operations at the very moment they needed more intelligence and flexibility. 4. The morale collapse of the PVO troops. For the air defense soldiers, their war changed from one of active defense to passive survival. They were no longer hunters, they were bait. The constant anxiety of emitting, the helplessness against an attack that gave no warning beyond a second's shriek, eroded unit cohesion and fighting spirit. Reports from veterans later spoke of crews refusing to power on their radars without direct, written orders from a superior, orders that were rarely given. The elite technical arm of the Soviet military had been humiliated by a weapon they could not comprehend or counter, creating a deep-seated cynicism and fear. 5. The scramble for intel and wreckage. Soviet intelligence priorities shifted urgently. GRU and KGB assets were tasked with one overriding objective: obtain an intact or near-intact HARM missile or its components. The fragments were not enough. They needed the guidance computer, the seeker-head logic. This led to increased risk-taking. Spetsnaz teams were directed to areas of suspected HARM strikes with orders to secure the wreckage before Mujahideen scavengers or CIA recovery teams could get to it. It is believed that at least one partially intact HARM seeker was successfully extracted and shipped to Moscow, providing the Soviet and later Russian military with their first concrete look at the technology that would define the next generation of aerial warfare. This silent, shadowy race for debris was a war within the war, underscoring the weapon's devastating strategic value. On the ground, the Soviet infantry and motor rifle units felt the effect indirectly. The helicopter support they called in was less responsive, often delayed as pilots and commanders weighed the Stinger threat below against the unknown electronic threat from above. The sense of having a secure, supportive sky overhead, a fundamental tenet of Soviet combined arms doctrine, was irrevocably broken. The battlefield, for the first time, felt truly enveloping, with danger potentially descending from any vector, seen or unseen. The reverberations of the HARM's first combat trials in Afghanistan extended far beyond the Hindu Kush, shaping military doctrines, technological development, and geopolitical perceptions for decades to come. The silent killer left echoes in war rooms from Moscow to Washington. For the United States, the Afghan theater became an irreplaceable live-fire testing ground. The CIA and the U.S. Navy, which owned the HARM and the A-6 platform, gathered petabytes of data, emitter fingerprints of Soviet radars in real combat conditions, the effectiveness of HARM's various seeker modes against actual Soviet countermeasures, the logistical and tactical requirements for deep, covert SAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, operations. This was not data from a sterile exercise or a simulated electronic warfare range. It was combat-proven validation. The lessons learned directly influenced the HARM software updates, the development of its successor, the ARGM, Advanced Anti-Radiation Guided Missile, and the SEAD tactics that would become the opening act of the 1991 Gulf War. The confidence to send F-4G Wild Weasels, and F divided by a -18s into the teeth of Iraq's dense, Soviet-model air defense network was born in part from the successes in the Afghan mountains. The impact on Soviet military thinking was profound and traumatic. The war had already exposed the weaknesses of their counterinsurgency doctrine. The HARM strikes exposed a fatal flaw in their peer conflict doctrine. Their entire air defense philosophy, the Great Shtora, that was to protect the motherland from NATO, was vulnerable to a weapon that turned their electronic eyes into liabilities. The frantic postmortems in Soviet design bureaus, KB, like Almaz and Vimpel led to a new priority: developing passive detection systems, improving decoy technology and accelerating their own arm programs. But the psychological blow was deeper. It instilled a generational caution in the Soviet and later Russian officer corps regarding over-reliance on active radar emission, a caution visibly evident in their later systems, which emphasized mobility, shoot-and-scoot tactics and passive sensors. Operation Desert Storm in 1991 has often been called the first harm war. That statement finds its roots in Afghanistan. The opening hours of the Gulf War saw a massive, coordinated SAD campaign using harms to blind and destroy Iraqi air defenses, creating corridors for strike packages. The tactics of emitter mapping, pre-briefed launches, and the use of decoys were all refined in the skies over Afghanistan. When Iraqi SAM operators experienced the same sudden radar-seeking annihilation that had baffled their Soviet counterparts years earlier, it was the culmination of a strategy proven in secret. The Afghan conflict provided the blueprint for achieving near-total air supremacy against the Soviet-style IADS. The success of Project 99 cemented a dangerous precedent in U.S.-Pakistani covert relations. It demonstrated that Pakistan's territory could be used not just for logistics and training, but for launching direct, deniable combat operations. This deepened the ISI's entanglement with the CIA and increased the risks of Soviet retaliation against Pakistan. It also set a template for future gray zone conflicts, where advanced weaponry is deployed through third parties and covert platforms, blurring the lines of direct engagement and accountability. Popular history and even many military analyses often cite the Stinger missile as the decisive factor in breaking Soviet air power in Afghanistan. While its psychological and tactical impact was immense, the harm campaign operated on a strategically more significant level. The Stinger forced Soviet aviation to fly higher and faster. The harm made the skies behind Soviet lines unsafe for the systems protecting those same aircraft. It was a systemic attack versus a tactical one. This dichotomy created a lasting lesson. The visible, infantry-level weapon often captures the narrative, while the invisible, systemic weapon changes the war. Future conflicts, from Kosovo to the present day, would see electronic warfare and SAD as the critical, if unglamorous, prerequisites for any successful air campaign. The final Soviet withdrawal in February 1989 was driven by a complex web of political, economic, and moral factors. But on the battlefield, the war had been lost in layers. The ground war was a bloody stalemate. The low-altitude air war had been leveled by the Stinger. And the high-altitude electronic war, the realm of command, control, and strategic mobility, had been decisively lost to a missile that hunted whispers. The silent killer had not just destroyed radars. It had helped dismantle the technological aura of a superpower, providing a glimpse of a frightening new era where information itself was the most vulnerable target. The story of the harm in Afghanistan is not one of pitched battles or heroic last stands. It is a quieter, more insidious tale of technological ambush. It exists in the space between perception and reality, between what a military believes its technology can do, and what a clever adversary has designed that technology to undo. This episode forces a reconsideration of the Afghan war's turning points. We memorialize the visceral image of the Stinger's smoke trail. But we should also consider the unseen arc of the harm. A launch from a shadowy aircraft in Pakistani airspace, a 90-second flight guided by the enemy's own arrogance, and a final, corrective explosion where a radar dish once rotated. One weapon gave the guerrilla a chance to fight back. The other removed the giant's ability to see the fight at all. It was a preview in a remote and savage theater of warfare's accelerating abstraction. The conflict ceased to be solely about men and terrain, and became about data and emission. The most valuable target was no longer the tank column or the command post, but the invisible lattice of energy that connected and protected them. The harm proved that in the modern age, to turn on your senses is to risk annihilation. Victory could be achieved not by overpowering an enemy's strength, but by weaponizing his awareness against him. For the Soviet Union, the experience was a quiet trauma that foreshadowed its collapse. It was a demonstration that their vast, monolithic military machine, built for a symmetrical European war, could be unpicked by a single intelligent weapon wielded with patience and precision. The confidence shattered in those Afghan mountains would never fully return. For the future of conflict, the lesson endures. Every advancement in sensing, every radar, every drone's camera, every data link, creates a corresponding vulnerability. The harm's first war established a grim, eternal rule. In the contest between the eye and the missile that hunts the eye, the missile holds the final advantage. The silent explosions of 1987 to 88 were not just the end of a Soviet tactic. They were the beginning of our current epoch, where the battlefield is first and foremost an electronic chessboard, and the first move is always to blind the other player.